So this video is about the events that led up to the American Revolutionary War. This is going to be the first video of a series on historical events. So I'm going to start off with the French and Indian War, which refers to the war fought in North America, or rather the sub-conflict in North America as part of the greater 7 Years' War from 1754 to 1763. So this will play a defining role going forward in the events leading up to the Revolution, because a lot of the acts that were passed by the Parliament that were detested by the colonists were acts that were passed to pay for war debt that was accumulated by Great Britain defending the American colonies in the French and Indian War against, as you would imagine, the French and their Indian allies. So the war ended in 1763, and there was an act right off the bat which actually was not related to, well, it was related to finance, but in a roundabout way. It's the Proclamation of 1763, which stated that colonists could not settle west of the Appalachians in order to kind of cut down on costs for defense. The Parliament knew that if the colonists were to settle west of the Appalachians, they were inevitably going to run into conflicts with the Indians and would in turn request royal military support, and as a colony of Great Britain, they would be obligated to defend the colonists. So that's the Proclamation of 1763. There's the Sugar Act of 1764, which was an interesting kind of amended repassing of the Sugar and Molasses Act of 1733, which in and of itself was a tariff on foreign, specifically French, molasses and sugar. The initial Molasses and Sugar Act had a 6 pence per gallon tariff. This Sugar Act of 1764 actually slashed it in half to 3 pence per gallon. It was thought that it would make this easier to enforce because people were less likely to smuggle if they had to pay a less onerous tax. There's the Stamp Act of 1765, the next year, which is also passed by Parliament to try to pay down the truly massive debt that Great Britain had acquired in the 7 Years' War. The Stamp Act was not only in response to the war debt, but also the fact that citizens of the empire in England proper were paying taxes at a far higher rate than the colonists. In fact, they were paying taxes that were so high that there were fears of open revolt in the 1760s in England. So this was passed to try and take the pressure off of the citizens on the home front and transfer some of that to the colonists, which is only fair given the fact that a huge expenditure was made to protect them. So the Stamp Act was an act that required a stamp, which was paid for via tax, on every piece of paper, playing cards, books, magazines, newspapers, things of that nature. The Virginia House of Burgesses and some other colonial organizations and legislatures balked at this at the urging of Patrick Henry and other firebrands. The Virginia colonial governor, royal governor, actually forced the House of Burgesses to close. He basically ended it for a time because they were deemed to be in a state of open rebellion, and he didn't want any trouble with Parliament back home. The next year, 2 years later, in 1767, actually, before I get to the Townshend Acts, I'm going to talk about the Stamp Act Congress, which, in addition to the Virginia House of Burgesses action, was a group of people that met in New York in 1765 to kind of formulate a colonial response to the Stamp Act and try to organize an organized resistance between all the colonies against the Stamp Act. So that was in 1765, and they sent over a Declaration of Rights to Parliament on a ship that had arrived in the colonies carrying Stamp Act stamped goods as kind of a fuck you. And the upper and lower houses of Parliament immediately rejected it because they feared that if they even took into consideration the Declaration of Rights, that it would set off a precedent that they couldn't come back from, dealing with their colonies overseas. So they just rejected that out of hand. and obviously that did little to assuage the anger of the colonists. However, the Stamp Act was repealed the next year in 1766. So while they paid no mind to the Declaration of Rights the Stamp Act Congress sent over to them, they realized and came to the conclusion in internal debates in Parliament that the continued existence and enforcement of the Stamp Act did more harm than good, in that the revenue it was collecting was not that high due to non-enforcement and people trying to get around it and just outright boycotts, and the fact that there was a very real chance that there could be an armed rebellion. So while they repealed it, it was repealed only if there was this other act that would be passed alongside it called the Declaratory Act, which basically stated that while they were agreeing to remove the Stamp Act, that it was not in any means to be considered a response to the Stamp Act Congress, that Parliament had every right to tax the colonists, and that it should not be viewed as any sort of precedent as a way to force Parliament's hand in the future on taxes. Of course, that's obviously not what occurred. If you read the timeline, it's obvious that this was a response to the Stamp Act Congress, but Parliament had to save face, and so they passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, which they would use as a justification for further taxes down the line. So that brings us to 1767. Where we have the Townshend Acts, which are 5 different acts that are named after the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who passed, or rather was, the brainchild behind them. The first was the Revenue Act of 1767, which took as its justification the Declaratory Act. This, in and of itself, was another tax on tea and paper, so a smaller version of the Stamp Act, basically. The Indemnity Act of 1767, which removed all taxes and tariffs on British East India Company tea. So the Indemnity Act took British East India Company tea and exempted it from the Revenue Act. There is the Commissioners of Customs Act of 1767, which basically stated that enforcement of the new Revenue Act would be harsh, because they didn't want to have to turn around and repeal another tax and lose face again. That included some provisioning for new customs officers in Boston and other major colonial ports. You have the New York Restraining Act of 1767, which threatened to liquidate the New York Assembly for actions against parliamentary acts and taxes, and basically the same thing that the Virginia House of Burgesses was closed for a time, not being in line with the royal line, basically. You have the Vice Admiralty Court Act of 1768, which stated that smugglers who were trying to get around this new Revenue Act would be allowed to be tried in a Admiralty court with no jury, which pissed off a lot of people. The Massachusetts legislature stated that these acts were intolerable. That's not to confuse them with the later intolerable acts, as they are known, but they said this is ridiculous, and they were forced by the royal governor and officials back in England either to basically be dissolved forcibly or to support the royal line, and they voted themselves out of existence rather than agree with the Townshend Acts. New York, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and other colonial legislatures followed suit and accepted what later came to be known as the Massachusetts Circular Letter, which was sort of an abrogated version of the Declaration of Rights from the earlier Stamp Act Congress in 1765. It was basically just a letter stating why these acts were not tolerable to the colonists. So much against the wishes of the royal governors of the various colonies, and of course the King and Parliament in England, several of these colonial legislatures took up this circular letter and passed resolutions in support of it. Now, much like the Stamp Act of 1765, which was repealed in 1766, the Townshend Acts of 1767 were repealed in April of 1770, except for the tax on tea. So again, you have colonial pressure being put on Parliament and on Great Britain, and them caving. So they caved once, and then they caved here again, with the exception of the tax on tea, which is from the Revenue Act. During this time, you have groups like the Sons of Liberty and the Committees of Correspondence. Committees of Correspondence were essentially shadow governments by these rebels. Shadow governments in that they were a shadow of the official royal colonial governments, which had to support and carry out enforcement of these acts, albeit some begrudgingly. And they were kind of the public face of the rebellion, whereas the Sons of Liberty were the more militant, armed wing of the rebellion, something akin to, a political party and a military wing. You have the Nazi Party and the SA. You have, Lenin and the Cheka. There's all sorts of examples of this through history. Of course, they weren't that organized because we're talking about, the late 18th century versus the examples from the 20th century that I used, but you get the idea. So those were meeting all throughout the colonies, specifically in New England and in Boston especially. So that brings us to the Boston Massacre of 1770, wherein a crowd of people were gathering around a British sentry. They didn't want British troops in Boston to begin with. They were giving this guy some trouble, pelting him with snowballs. Eventually, some more British troops came to back up this sentry. In the chaos and the melee that ensued, 3 people were shot and killed. The royal governor of Boston tried to get people to calm down by saying there would be an independent inquiry into things. Despite that, soon thereafter, the British troops in Boston were evacuated to an island just off the coast, whereby they felt that they would be, a bit safer and that it would cut down on these violent interactions between the populace and the military. Then I'm going to go to the Boston Tea Party of 1773. So the massacre was in 1770. You have the Tea Party 3 years later, and all throughout this time you have the Committees of Correspondence and the Sons of Liberty, and various people like Patrick Henry and other firebrands just creating this atmosphere of tension and hostility, which the Parliamentary Act certainly did not help. So the Boston Tea Party was in defiance to yet another new colonial, or rather parliamentary act, called the Tea Act of 1773. Now the Tea Act of 1773, it was basically a follow-up to the Indemnity Act of 1767, and it made British East India Company tea cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea, which a lot of the colonial leaders at the time were running a smuggling operation with. So that was undercutting all of their gains. And the colonists themselves, who weren't necessarily profiting off of the tea smuggling, felt that it was unfair for the Parliament to basically force them to buy this British tea, because there were legitimate colonial tea traders as well who had to pay import taxes and duties, and they were just priced out of the market by this British East India Company tea. There was a lot of financial troubles with the British East India Company at the time. They had a bunch of tea that was threatening to go bad in warehouses, and they really needed to offload that stock. So that put pressure on the Parliament, who in turn passed the Tea Act of 1773, screwing over the colonial traders and certainly the smugglers, who were also feeling the heat from the Commissioners of Customs Act 1767 that I spoke of earlier, which really ramped up the enforcement of these acts, not only taxation but actions against smugglers, who by the Vice Admiralty Court Act of 1768 no longer had a right to trial by jury. So there's that. I'm going to come back with a second part of this because this is going to cut me off at 15 minutes. So I will see you in the next video.